I've got a really sharp Najdorf variation to show you from round 5 of the Tata Steel tournament. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. Links down there in the video description. So here we go. This is Nils Grandelius playing with white. He's 27 years old, from Sweden. He was a second for Magnus Carlsen in the 2018 World Championship match, and subsequently, shortly after that, he came equal first in the European Individual Championship in 2019. So he's not bad. With black, well, we have arguably the greatest expert in the Najdorf variation, Vachier-Lagrave. Of course, he is doing very well in the candidates tournament that was suspended last year, tying first at the moment. So, well, great expectations on him. So Nils Grandelius going in for the, you could say, the acid test of the Najdorf, bishop g5, and Vachier-Lagrave. This is the sharpest of them all. The so-called poisoned pawn variation, of course, a favourite of Garry Kasparov. Fischer used to play it, although he switched after a bit too scary for him, I suspect. But Garry Kasparov, well, this was his main variation, his main counter to bishop g5. And as you can imagine, in these days of computer preparation, so many games have been played with this. Not just at the highest level, but actually, you know, there are a lot of sort of email correspondence games you find have been played in this line. And this is, you could say, one of the main lines. And here, well, the main move is knight c6. I won't go into detail on that one, but bishop e7 has been championed by Vachier-Lagrave and also Jan Nepomniachtchi over the last few years. Well, let's take a look. Basically, white carries out his plan of softening up the e6 square. If pawn takes pawn, then bishop c4, and you have knight and bishop looking at the e6 pawn. So bishop takes pawn, knight takes bishop, and bishop c4 anyway. So this is the whole point, that it's very difficult to protect that properly. And if it advances, well, that's a complete disaster. It gives away all the light squares. And the b7 pawn is vulnerable as well. So black has to compromise and give up one of these pawns. Knight d7. Now, if rook takes pawn, then actually knight c5 is pretty much okay for black. That knight looking good on c5. Bishop takes pawn, however, doesn't look bad for white. Means that the king can't castle. It's a very messy position. I mean, at first glance, it looks as though white is doing extremely well here. But actually, white's king is still in the middle as well. And the pawns are very messy. There are lots of holes here that potentially black's pieces could settle on. And the knight on c3 isn't very stable. It's not supported by a pawn on b2. Knight c5, and this is the point actually, that basically black can get rid of that important light squared bishop and bring the king to safety. As I said, this has been tested before. We've seen bishop c4 played before. In fact, Maxime lost a game against bishop c4 against Caruana, but well, after bishop c4 it's been shown that actually b5 is a good move there. Bishop f5 has also been seen, but that's okay for black. Bishop b3 played, and this has been tested in quite a few email games actually, and I'm sure Maxime was aware of that, but well, he started spending a bit of time, so maybe he wasn't so booked up. Anyway, it was clear that Nils Grandelius had done his homework. Castle's kingside, so white's king is safe, or safe enough anyway. That bishop is exchanged off, that really important bishop. Queen c5 check. The queen returns into the centre with tempo. Check. And the bishop drops back, attacking the queen. And queen c4. So the rook and queen are combining pretty well on the c-file. Black is preparing to castle kingside. That knight is protected by rook and queen, although, you know, it would like some proper support. And of course behind it is a weak pawn on c2. That pawn on e4 also isolated. So it feels as though black is kind of coordinating reasonably well. Nevertheless, it's still tricky and black has yet to castle. Rook f4 played by Grandelius. So he was playing his moves pretty quickly, whereas Vachier-Lagrave was taking his time. So rook f4 protects the pawn, and you never know, there could be a discovered attack as well. And here Vachier-Lagrave thought for 18.5 minutes. And basically he bottled it in this position. He retreated his queen and allowed white to take a pawn. The move that is best in this position is knight h5. And this has been played in, as I said, various email correspondence games. So the rook is attacked. So the rook has to drop. So let's say rook f3. And then the best move is simply to come back again to f6. It feels as though, you know, black is losing time playing like this. But actually, it's very hard for white to exploit this. Basically, black just wants to castle on the next turn. And this could well end in a draw by repetition. I mean, there are other ways to play this. A4 is possible. Just allow black to castle and then play rook f4. That's possible. But it should be okay for black. It's still pretty sharp. But it looks as though Grandelius was very well prepared, extremely well prepared, better than Vachier-Lagrave, who dropped back in this position, queen e6, and that simply allowed white to take on b7. And if you count the pawns, white is a pawn up. But at least black's king has managed to get to safety. So this is a compromise by Vachier-Lagrave. He's a pawn down. But he probably figured, well, perhaps I can hold this because white's pawns here are isolated. Black is pretty compact. Black's pieces are pretty good here. Nice centralization. So how can white kind of consolidate this one? Well, here Grandelius thought for 36 minutes. Wow. Having used his opening preparation, now he's got to play the game. And the preparation has worked out pretty well. h3. Now that's a nice move. In fact, white doesn't need to go crazy here. So that protects the g4 square and potentially gives the king just a nice little bolt hole on h2. And from black's viewpoint, this rook is an absolute pain. Beautiful position on the 7th rank. So Vachier-Lagrave decides I need to exchange that off. But nah. Grandelius plays hard to get. Rook a7, keeps the rook on the 7th. And Maxime thinks, well, got to get rid of that. Okay, so Grandelius exchanges off now, but that has left black's rook in a passive position. Not just a passive position, but actually tactically a problematic position, actually. And knight d5 is a very straightforward move, excellent move. If, well, let me see. Knight takes pawn actually loses straight away. Tactically not good. Queen d5 check. Check. Hits the rook and hits the knight. Complete disaster. Let's go back. If knight takes knight, well, we can just recapture. It's a clear pawn up for white, and white's pieces looking pretty healthy. So rook b8 played by Vachier-Lagrave, looking to activate. Gets the rook off a, well, tactically sensitive square and just trying to activate. c4. Okay, looks pretty nice. Just cements that knight on d5. Looks very sound. And once again, knight takes pawn. Tactically still a problem. Queen d5 check. Simple double attack. So Vachier-Lagrave just drops the bishop to d8. It's a bit passive, but basically black can't do that much. Queen f2. Good move. Well, that pins the black knight. It's mate on f8. And that bishop, you can see, it's not in a great position. So things looking very nice for Grandelius at this point. In fact, you could say all his pieces beautifully placed. Knight d7. Well, f8 is covered by the knight, but it's not beautiful. Bishop d4. Well, white building up beautifully. And now the bishop pointing at g7. Bishop g5. So at least the rook is now covering the back rank here. But still, rook f5. White still really active. Hitting the bishop. Bishop h6. Yes, it covers g7, but that bishop is sidelined. It's not beautiful. Now, Grandelius' next move I really like. All his pieces are well placed. In fact, well, I say all his pieces. What's the one piece in the position that could maybe just be improved just a little bit? The king. King h2. I do like that move. It just tucks the king away. There was no clear way forward, but now the king is just taken off the back rank. No irritating checks here to deal with. It's perfectly safe on h2. The e5 square is covered. No chance at the moment of checks on this diagonal. And with the king safe, then you can turn your attention to going full steam ahead with the rest of your pieces. What about queen takes e4? Well, let's just deal with that one. Rook f7 is very powerful. Hitting the knight. If the knight moves, then knight e7 check. The king goes in the corner and mate next move. Okay, what about protecting the knight? Rook d8. Now this is very nice. Knight e7 check. King goes in the corner. And here you can see the rook and bishop lined up on g7. And a winning move is g4. Very blunt, but very powerful. Just threatening g5. And once the bishop leaves there, then of course white is going to deliver mate. And there's no decent defense to this pawn push. g5. White is in complete control here. Wonderful pieces. So black is in trouble after king h2. Rook c8 played. Queen g3, building up nicely. g6 played. I mean, there isn't really a good move for black in this position. And this is very nice. Good calculation by Grandelius. He was investing a lot of time at this point, but still he got there. Queen h4. Hitting the bishop. If pawn takes rook, then pawn takes pawn. This is good calculation. Of course, queen takes pawn allows knight e7 check. And let's say, well, queen f7, knight check, knight takes rook, for example. So queen h4, nice bit of calculation. The bishop dropped back. And again, great calculation at the end. Rook f6. If knight takes, check. And we crash through on h7. And knight g4, there's no good defense to the bishop. Watch out for knight h6 at some moment. So rook f6 played, queen e8. And again, great calculation. Rook takes bishop. If knight takes, we've got knight f6 for king, king, and queen. Thank you very much. And queen takes, f8. This is the game continuation. Knight check, knight takes rook. And that was the end of the game. If, well, of course, to keep going, you have to take the knight, but then simply queen takes pawn. And, well, that's just horrific, of course. So that's the final position. Well, a very impressive piece of calculation at the end. Very impressive preparation from the opening. And I think Nils Grandelius played a very competent game there. And he now is in the sole lead in the tournament because, well, there were lots of draws today in the Tata Steel tournament. Some fascinating games. Magnus Carlsen couldn't quite grind down Donchenko. But yeah, really interesting day at the Tata Steel tournament. So more coming tomorrow. Let's see if Grandelius can hold on to that lead.